Our chief medical correspondent, Dr. Sanjay Gupta, sat down for a 3-hour one-on-one with controversial podcast host Joe Rogan last night. Rogan remains a vaccine skeptic despite having caught COVID-19 himself. Let's listen to part of this.
So would you now, with what you know now, and having had COVID, would you have wished that you had been vaccinated?
No.
Beforehand?
But I got
You almost
through
got
it.
vaccinated.
Yeah, but I explained
You
all
got
that.
through it.
But I got through COVID.
Yeah.
Pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So that was my thought was, I'm a healthy person. I exercise constantly. I'm always taking vitamins. I take care of myself. I felt like I was going to be okay, and that was true. It was correct. I'm happy. I got through it. I don't wish it upon anyone. It wasn't fun, but it wasn't the worst cold I've ever had, and I got over it fairly quickly, relatively speaking.
I think that, and again, I am truly glad about that. I'm not, all kidding aside, I don't think anybody wishes you, everyone wants you to be well and healthy. But I think the question is just in terms of the nuance of this. It's not a strategy to recommend people get infected.
I'm not recommending
immunity.
anybody get infected.
So they should get vaccinated.
I think a lot of people should get vaccinated.
You're
but
talking,
I think
you're talking a lot
should,
of vulnerable people.
Yeah.
If you just said vulnerable people,
yeah,
there'd be a lot
older
of people.
fat people, I think a lot of those folks. My real concern is this urge to vaccinate children. And I don't know what kind of data we have on the long-term effects of this.
As Carla wonders if she can
We don't
retire
need
sooner.
these commercials. Be quiet, you commercial. Okay, while the commercial is going, because it's a very professional organization that we run here at Quibbles Over Coffee, I don't know. I just feel like this. Oh, actually, let's listen to him. Let's let him.
With us now, Sanjay. Sanjay, first off, I mean, I'm so glad you did this because there's so many people who can listen to the sense that you make. Tell us why you thought this was so important.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I mean, I think the media landscape's pretty segmented, as we know, and I think there's a lot of people who listen on CNN who are accepting and hearing these messages and understanding the science. But I wanted to go to a place where there was clearly, he has a big audience, and as you mentioned, he's been a skeptic of the vaccines. I listened to his podcast. I thought there could be some common ground there, and decided, to lean into the nuance for 3 hours, which, by the way, is a long time to talk to anybody. I don't know that I've talked to anybody, no breaks, no distractions, no phones for 3 hours before, but I think that's how you get at some of, these real conversations.
Look, we talk to you for 3 hours, but they're always trying to wrap us, always after the second question, Sanjay. I do want to play another exchange you had with him.
Well, so before he does, I think this is an interesting point about the difference in media between something like CNN and something like Joe Rogan, because obviously CNN is sort of the quintessential version of old media. And Joe Rogan, in a sense, is also the quintessential version of new media. I shouldn't say old, legacy media and new media, maybe, is probably a better way of thinking of it. But because old makes it sound like it's bad. I'm not trying to knock them here. I'm trying to say this in a value neutral way. But when we think about Joe Rogan, what makes him successful is the fact that he's able to go in depth for 3 hours with one person, and that one person gets a huge amount of, by the end of those 3 hours, and he's particularly good at this because he's a great interviewer, but any 3 hour long podcast, if you've listened to a 3 hour long podcast, you get to know the people talking, in a sort of parasocial way. Obviously, I'm not saying that you know them on a personal level, but you understand where they're coming from ideologically in a way that it's difficult to understand when you just watch a short clip on CNN. There are also consequences, though, and the consequences are this. Well, Joe Rogan is not an expert really in anything. And even when he has experts on, because of the way that the flow of conversation actually operates when you're talking to anyone for 3 hours, there's a sort of definitional situation which results in the fact that it's such a long period of time, which is that you end up talking about things that you don't really know what you're talking about. And we all are guilty of that, whether we're in media or no. Everyone is guilty of sometimes talking about stuff that we don't really know what we're talking about. But there is a sense in which CNN is more buttoned up in which CNN, right, they're not going to have Sanjay Gupta talk about the primary elections, right, presumably. He's presumably just going to talk about medical issues. And he does know what he's talking about in terms of medical issues. He's a doctor. He genuinely does have a real history. I believe he's a professor at some sort of place. Actually, I should look that up. I'm curious if he's a professor. I don't want to be spreading misinformation. So let's see. Let's just look up Sanjay Gupta. Sanjay Gupta. Ignore that. That was me yelling, trying to consider if I wanted to. Yeah, he's an Emory. Emory. Wait, no. Yeah, he went to the University of Michigan, and he's currently. I thought he was working somewhere. Yes, he's the executive vice president for health affairs at Emory University. So like there's a real value to having something who's a real expert like him be the kind of person that you're gonna have on to talk about medical issues. But there's also a cost to the fact that you don't build up that same sort of trust and that same sort of association with that individual person, right? People who watch Joe Rogan respect Joe Rogan, and they have an underlying belief that is not crazy, that Joe Rogan is not bullshitting them, is not trying to hide stuff from them, right? When you hear Joe Rogan talk, you have a sort of an understanding that Joe Rogan is saying to you, not necessarily the truth, but at the very least what Joe actually thinks. And that's something you're able to build up in new media, because in new media, people get to know the individual content creator rather than knowing CNN. Because I got to be honest, like, I watch CNN relatively frequently, not necessarily as frequently as others do, but I don't know either of those people on the screen right now other than Sanjay Gupta. And I don't necessarily know Sanjay Gupta particularly well. I just know him because there's been a bunch of stuff about him in terms of COVID, right? But like, I don't know these people, right? And I think that's true of the majority of people who just open up CNN. So I don't really have any sort of expectations positively or negatively of these people. I sort of just see them as sort of some sort of in-between for me to get to the news. Anyway, let's continue.
You heard him talk about vaccines and kids there. This is another exchange you had on that.
And, myocarditis can be a really frightening thing. They can develop chest pain, shortness of breath, things like that.
It's inflammation of the heart.
That's what it is. And you got to think of it like this. The reason it can happen in young people, it can happen in anybody, but people who have really robust immune response. You're basically giving the vaccine and you're counting on the immune system to really respond to that. If it responds a lot in someone with a really healthy immune system, it can cause more widespread inflammation. People feel miserable for a day or two, and in this case, it can cause inflammation around the heart.
Do we know what the long-term consequences of myocarditis in young people that comes from the vaccine are?
I don't think we don't know. And I think the only way we can know long-term things, to be perfectly honest, of any of these aspects of the vaccine, the only way we can know long-term stuff is with the passage of time, for certain.
That's terrifying for parents.
It is.
The idea that your son could get vaccinated and most likely he would have been fine if he got COVID, and that your son could catch myocarditis and have permanent heart
Okay, so
problems.
This is another interesting
I don't know that.
This is another interesting thing that I think is worth talking about. That is that Joe Rogan is more willing to shoot off at the mouth. Joe Rogan is willing and able to be wrong in a way that someone like Sanjay Gupta isn't, right? There are consequences in terms of his career. There's consequences in terms of, and I don't just mean that in terms of his career in the media. I mean consequences in terms of his job at a university. If he's shooting off at the mouth and if he's saying stuff that's wrong. But if Joe says something that's wrong, he just corrects himself. He just goes, oh, that was wrong. And he moves on. Right? And he can do that a week later. He can do that a month later. He can do that a year later. And he just go, oh, okay. Anyway, let's get back to talking to Bert Kreischer. Right? And that doesn't hurt him. That doesn't destroy his brand. But Sanjay Gupta, because he is concerned about being wrong to a level that Joe doesn't have to be, is therefore in a situation where when Joe is talking, well, let this finish. Actually.
We can say the person will be fine if they get COVID, Joe.
A young boy?
Well, if
most young boys with no comorbidities.
When you say fine, you mean what? That they're not going to die?
I mean, like me. I had COVID.
You look like you're strong as an ox. Yes, I give you that. But you get teenagers who will have these long COVID naps. You get.
What does that mean?
They're tired all the time. They get these sort of long hauler type symptoms. Less so in kids, but when you talk about 33% of people having persistent symptoms that last months, I just feel like I think we're allowed to have a nuanced conversation about this. We measure things in terms of life and death.
Yes.
And I get that. I mean, it's easy. It's public health. That's the way the numbers get presented. And frankly, that's our fault as well in the media to just say this is how many people have died. We don't know a lot about what this virus does to the body.
Right.
We probably shouldn't just think of it as another type of pneumonia or cold, because it's clearly doing something else. A cold wouldn't just cause isolated loss of smell. Flu wouldn't even do that. And then so many people developing long-term symptoms.
Another one of those commercials. We will mute it and we will continue. So yeah, I think this is interesting, right? There's this huge distinction between the way that they approach media and the way that they have to approach media. And I just don't know how we're going to be able to see this change over time, because we're going to have to figure out a way to do a couple of things. Number one, let's be honest, right? The number of people in my generation that are watching places like CNN, that are watching places like Fox, watching things like MSNBC, it's decreasing. It's decreasing rapidly. Joe Rogan is the future. Sanjay Gupta is the past. And that's not knocking Sanjay Gupta, because I think that Sanjay Gupta in a lot of ways is more sensible in the way that he approaches media than is Joe. There are problems with Sanjay too. The problem with an organization like CNN is that they have a lot of legacy bias. They have a lot of sort of insider politics, right? They're constantly sort of, in a way that Joe is able to build his career by talking to Andrew Schultz. And maybe he won't criticize Andrew Schultz. Maybe he won't criticize, the sports ball players and the smacky sport players in the way that he potentially should, right? But I don't really care about the smacky sport players. And the reality is that CNN, in a way that Joe isn't, is reliant in order to succeed financially on the access that they have to senators, the way that they have access to presidents, the way they have access to congresspeople, to governors, right? And so, for them to be able to continue to matter or to be seen as relevant requires something different than what Joe requires. Joe has people like Bernie Sanders on his show, sure. He's had Andrew Yang on the show, sure. He's had Cornel West on the show, sure. He's had Tulsi Gabbard and what's his face, the Dan Crenshaw, the silly one, the congressman from Texas, Republican congressman from Texas. All of these people he has on the show, but he's not reliant on them in order to succeed financially. He's not reliant. They're not the bread and butter of his show. They're not the bread and butter of his empire. And similarly, someone like David Pakman, who's different than is Joe, because David Pakman is building his career specifically in the context of news, specifically in the context of politics, right? Someone like Brian Tyler Cohen, specifically in the context of news, specifically in the context of politics, specifically someone like Kyle Kulinski, specifically someone like Jimmy Dore, who obviously I hate. But these people are examples of people who are able to build their empire. I mean, let's look really quickly at the difference, right? Let's close out of this. The difference between something like CNN, their YouTube channel, right, and what they're getting their views on, right? And let's compare that to what the people of how do I do this? I just want to go to CNN. There we go. So here's CNN, right? And if we look at CNN and we sort by the most popular videos, we see Obama. Okay, now we see some Trump supporters, right? The majority of their stuff is coming in a couple of different things. Some of these are examples of just clips that anyone could do, right? Anyone could do this clip of this judge flipping out. We've actually covered this in behalf before because I think it's crazy. All of these are examples of that, but they also are extremely reliant on having Trump sit down for an interview. They're extremely reliant on getting debates. They're extremely reliant on being able to talk to, all of these different people who are deeply entrenched in the political machine. But let's compare that to Kyle Kulinski, right? Whether you like Kyle Kulinski or no, let's compare that to what is the most watched videos on Kyle Kulinski's show, right? These same things of the clickbait nonsense that anyone could do, but also a lot of it is him talking about Noam Chomsky. Not interviewing Noam Chomsky, him talking about Noam Chomsky. It's things like him talking about Jimmy Carter, not interviewing Jimmy Carter, but talking about Jimmy Carter. And that means that he is not reliant. In order for him to succeed, he doesn't need to talk to Sam Harris. He just needs to talk about Sam Harris. He doesn't need to talk to Russell Brand. He just needs to talk about Russell Brand in order to get 1 million views, right? All of this is different. It's fundamentally different. It's fundamentally different because it means that he's not reliant. What I worry about is people like Dave Rubin, because Dave Rubin is reliant, right? If you look at Dave Rubin's show, and Dave Rubin probably doesn't care because Dave Rubin is kind of a grifter, let's be honest. The Rubin Report is successful because it's constantly talking to people. And he's moving away from this, actually, to his credit. He's doing a much more direct-to-camera talking without talking to people, right? But historically, the success of the Rubin Report, with the exception of the stuff way back in the day of the TYT days, but the majority of it, right, if you look at this is Ben Shapiro. He has to have access to Ben Shapiro. This is Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro. Has to have access to Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson, right? Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro. Milo Yiannopoulos, right? Stephen Fry, Candace Owens, right? All of this is interviews with people. And I worry that the interview culture is dangerous, right? It's dangerous specifically when you're reliant not on interviewing people writ large, not on famous people writ large, because let's be honest, I don't care if you're reliant on the smacky sport players, because the smacky sport players don't matter that much. So the fact that Joe Rogan is relying on the smacky sport players, which he would not have a $100 million empire like he does in the context through the Joe Rogan experience, unless those people were bringing in serious numbers when he was talking to these big celebrities. But let's look at Joe Rogan's numbers, right? Like most of it is moved over to Spotify. I get that, but we still have some videos up. And let's look at the videos that are up. What is the most popular video on his thing? Elon Musk, right? Not a politician. Alex Jones, insane, not a politician. Ed Snowden, right? Very smart, not a politician. Another Elon Musk. Alex Jones and Tim Dillon, right? Mike Tyson, right? Ben Shapiro is the first person. We've gone through 6 different things before we get to Ben Shapiro, who's the first person who's an actual political person, right? Then you get to Neil deGrasse Tyson. If you go down the list of all of the views that he's pulling into his show, the vast majority of these views are not coming in. Here's Robert Downey Jr., here's George Knapp, right? All of these, Kanye West, right? All of these people are not political. Kevin Hart is getting just as many views there as Bernie Sanders is, right? Kanye West is getting more, right? Joey Diaz is getting 12 million views. That's more than when you go way down here and you find, Kyle Kalinske or whoever it might be, right? He's not reliant on the political. The political is a tiny fraction of what he's doing. That's different than CNN. CNN is reliant. Let's continue.
Whew. It's a lot there. It's like trying to herd cats, Sanjay, in a discussion like that. He shoots off in all these different tangents. And he says there's a lot we don't know about this, that, and the other thing. Myocarditis, though, when you're talking about risks of myocarditis, which is inflammation around the heart, we know the risks of COVID causing that, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, and therein lies the nuance again. It is a fair question to bring up the idea of the side effect of the vaccines potentially being myocarditis. But you also have to compare this to the risk of myocarditis from the disease itself. And let me show you, because I think this was the data that Joe was talking about, although, it's tough sometimes to keep up. But overall, if you look and say there's a background rate of myocarditis that just occurs even before the pandemic, with the vaccines, how many more additional cases per 100,000 people? About 2.7, as you can see there. But from the disease itself, it's around 11. To be fair, both of these are rare, and almost always these cases of myocarditis resolved. People were fine, they didn't require further treatment. But this is the whole point. The numbers you see on the screen is the whole point. You want to try and obviously reduce risk of any of these things while really emphasizing the benefits. The vaccines offer lots of benefits and actually have a lower risk of myocarditis versus the disease itself.
You mentioned, and he seems to go back time and again to this idea that maybe getting COVID is better than getting the vaccine. I heard that repeatedly. Here's some of what he said.
Testing is obviously testing you to see if you have the virus.
Yes.
The therapeutic is to treat you because you have the virus.
Yes.
I still think it'd be better not to get the virus.
I think it'd be better to get the virus and recover and have amazing immunity to it. Wouldn't it be?
Well, you could get sick, though.
You know what I think you should do? I think you should get vaccinated and then get sick.
What?
This is why. Because then you got the vaccine protects you from a bad infection, and then you get COVID, so then you get the robust immunity that's imparted from having the actual disease itself, which is far more complex and comprehensive than you're getting from the vaccine that targets one specific protein, right?
You could make that argument, I think.
Yeah, so that's the move. You get vaccinated, let it wane, and hang around with a bunch of dirty people.
Okay, well,
and then get a lot of therapeutics on hand so you can take care of it quickly.
I will see your...
So let's unpack that. Actually, I mean, let's let Sanjay respond to it, but then let's unpack it because I think that's interesting.
Your recommendation.
And do it?
And give you a
should have come out with us last night. You probably would have caught it.
I almost did. Yeah.
So this is obviously
now
a joke.
Now I know what your
right?
secret plan was. No.
It's obviously a joke. Joe doesn't actually believe that. But it's difficult because Sanjay is not used to joking in the context of him sharing his political prescriptions. Right? He's not used to talking about serious, real COVID issues that are really affecting millions of people, and then immediately flitting in between, discussions about going out to drink. Right? This is something that podcasts constantly do. Right? But it's not something that people like CNN are used to. It's not something that Sanjay is used to. And so he doesn't know how to respond. So he's sort of awkwardly laughing, right? At one point, I watched the full interview. At one point, Joe Rogan made a bunch of jokes at the expense of Bert Kreischer being fat, right? And Sanjay had this look of horror. Like Joe was making fun categorically of all fat people, when in reality Bert is a close friend of Joe's, and Bert makes fat jokes constantly. They're both comedians, right? It's not like it was some mean-spirited intense attack, but Sanjay took it very seriously as this sort of underlying question of whether or not obesity is a serious problem in relation to COVID, and in terms of all of this sort of he took it so seriously, and there was just sort of the whole network, the whole sort of world of CNN, the world of legacy media trains you to be very closed, to be very sort of insular in that way, which in some ways is good because it means per minute that they're more efficient in delivering information than something like Joe Rogan. Per minute, they're more speedily able to provide stuff than other news organizations, not even news organizations, but than other I guess edutainment is what Demon Mama calls it, right? Other channels of information gathering that are simultaneously education and also entertainment. And it makes someone like Sanjay extremely uncomfortable, and you can see it. I mean, it's palpably obvious in his face how uncomfortable he is when there's this sort of flitting between actual, real ideas that Joe is actually suggesting that he's trying to grapple with, and this sort of undergirding let's have some drinks, right? He's not used to that. It makes him uncomfortable. It's just interesting.
So for you, Joe Rogan.
Yes.
I would say you've had it.
Yes.
So now get one shot of the vaccine.
No.
Why not?
Because I have better immunity than I would if I was vaccinated.
But does he, Sanjay? Also, he's not a doctor. He sure is talking like one, as if he is one, though.
That's also true.
By the way, it was 3 hours of that, just to give you an idea. I mean, it was a lot of mental gymnastics. And again, there's a nuance here. People who have been infected do have natural immunity. And there was a study out of Israel, which made got a lot of attention, that basically showed, at least for a period of time, their immunity was stronger than those who had received the vaccine. Here's a problem, though. One is we don't know how long that immunity lasts. People are trying to investigate that. And one of the studies that's come out showed that people who had natural immunity versus vaccinated immunity, those with natural immunity were twice as likely to get reinfected. I mean, this is the data. We know with the vaccine now from the clinical trials and real-world data, some 6 billion shots being given out around the world, that it is a safe and effective vaccine. So infection over vaccination should never be the message. No, people should not go out there and willingly get infected in pursuit of, this natural immunity. That's a terrible strategy. I think Joe.
So here's the other interesting thing. There's a power imbalance. And there's a power imbalance whenever Joe has anyone on, because Joe is simply the largest podcast in the world, right? So anyone who goes on to the Joe Rogan Experience definitionally has a smaller media empire, has a smaller sort of information platform than does Joe. Right? I mean, like famously, when Elon Musk went on, literally, Joe got him to smoke pot, and the result was, it was like a single, right? It was not a lot of pot. Smoked like a tiny bit of a joint. And the result was literally something like $2 billion of Tesla stock went up in smoke, literally, in a matter of like minutes after it was uploaded to YouTube. And so the idea of like that kind of power, it terrifies someone like Sanjay Gupta, rightly. And it for anyone who is worried about the implications of their rhetoric on the broad public, when you're sitting down with someone like Joe and you know that literally millions, potentially tens of millions of people are listening to every word that you say for the next 3 hours, that is terrifying. That is exhausting. And Sanjay is looking at this from a variety of places. He's looking at this from an educational perspective, but he's also looking at it from a perspective of, listen, bud, right? 700,000 Americans are dead, right? And so, like, when Joe is saying this complete bullshit about, like, I don't know if I'm going to get vaccinated, man. Like, I'm not sure if getting vaccinated makes sense. That's bullshit, okay? It's just complete nonsense, right? And Sanjay knows better than almost anyone on earth that that is complete and utter horseshit, okay? But simultaneously, he's trying really hard, not just to like come across as a jerk and just tell Joe that he's full of shit, because he can't do that in a way that fits into the Joe Rogan Experience kind of world that will actually be heard in a productive way by the audience, because there's a huge class divide that's going on here as well, right? The class divide thing that's going on is really interesting as well. Everyone on that right there is in a suit, right? She's not, I mean, she's a woman, so she's not wearing a suit in the same way, but she's wearing something that is a suit equivalent kind of dress, right? They're all in business attire, right? What does that mean? Why are they in business attire, right? Like, unpack that. What does it mean that you can show up to the Joe Rogan Experience in a t-shirt and have an audience that is literally tenfold the audience that is watching primetime CNN in some cases, right? When we think about something like the Elon Musk interview, when we think about something like the Kanye West interview, when we think about something like the Bernie Sanders interview, that got literally 10 times the order of magnitude more of an audience than something like CNN on a given afternoon. When we talk about someone with that much power showing up in a t-shirt, right? What does it mean? Why is he doing that? It's not even just about like what he actually thinks, but it's about what he's messaging and what they're messaging. And what they're messaging is legitimacy, but they're also messaging elitism. That is what all people in legacy media message. Their legitimacy comes from their elitism. Their legitimacy comes from their access to senators. Their legitimacy comes from their access to people in academia. Their legitimacy comes from all of this kind of access journalism, right? And there are real problems with that, not just in terms of what they say, but in terms of how they're perceived, right? They're perceived as the equivalent to a senator. And a lot of people don't like senators. For good reason, a lot of people don't like senators. They're received as though they are the same as Washington, D.C. And for the most part, that's kind of true, unfortunately. When I think about someone like Brian Stelter, I'm sorry, Brian Stelter is a partisan hack. It's true. He might be my partisan hack. He might be a left-wing partisan hack. Not really left-wing. Democratic Party partisan hack. But he's a partisan hack. Sean Hannity is a partisan hack. And he is a person who is simply in it for the money. He is someone, and this is not just true on the right. This is not just true on Fox News. This is not just true on OAN. This is not just true on Newsmax. A lot of these people are in it to be making millions of dollars. A lot of these people are in it to get all of this access. A lot of people are in it because they want to be hanging out with senators. They want to be hanging out with presidents. They want to be able to blah, 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 all of that. And it means that when Sanjay comes across as, throwing around, oh, I'm a professor. Oh, I'm a doctor. Oh, I'm a blah, 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 blah. That actually makes him less successful in his ability to be convincing than someone who is, like Kyle Kalinske, who's just sort of like a bumbling buffoon from YouTube space. And that's not a knock on Kyle, right? That is just a reality that is true of me as well, that we're just bumbling idiots, hanging out on the internet in our t-shirt. I am wearing pants, to clarify. They're shorts, but it looks from the angle that you're looking at me like I'm literally not wearing pants. I'm just sitting here in my underwear, right? And like, that's a decision that I've made. I could be wearing a suit right now, but it's a decision that I've made. And I think it's interesting to think about the distinction between this version of media, the version of legitimacy of new media that comes primarily from your ability to be seen as relating with the audience, comparative to the version of media that frames you as though you are the person who is an expert. You are the person who really knows your shit. And so, I don't know, I just think it's really an interesting sort of clash between cultures.
Understood that, although near the end of the podcast, he was advocating that I go get COVID. So, still to this point, I'm not sure if he was joking. I think he was joking, but that is a terrible strategy, obviously.
It doesn't really matter if he's joking, does it? If the millions of people listening to him don't know if he's joking at that point.
And that's another interesting point. And I agree with that, actually, at some level. The question is, because I think a lot of people, and this is not just a Joe thing, there are a lot of people who think about comedians as deserving some sort of different sort of lens, right? We think of like, John Oliver or Stewart, right? Or Trevor Noah, any of these people. They're comedians, right? They're just trying to make a joke. So therefore, their political ideology is they deserve a pass on it. No, that's not true. I think that when you say something political, whether it's being said as a comedian, or it's being said as someone who is, a person on CNN or any number of things. If you're on Comedy Central, I don't think that gets you some sort of leniency that you don't get on CNN or you don't get on Fox. And that goes in two directions, right? I don't think that you have an obligation as an audience to allow bad jokes on CNN and just sort of awkwardly laugh through them. If the person's not funny, the person's not funny, and you don't owe them a joke, you don't owe them a laugh rather, if they're not funny. And similarly, if the person's not, if the person is stealing jokes, let's say, right, the immorality around comedy exists as well. And if you're stealing jokes, I don't care if it's Sanjay Gupta stealing jokes when obviously he's not a comedian. If someone's stealing jokes and he's putting them on if Anderson Cooper is stealing shit and he's using those jokes on CNN in a prime time, that's not okay. You can't do that. And similarly, if Tim Dillon or Andrew Schultz or Joe Rogan or whoever it might be in the comedian space is saying something that is just demonstrably untrue, I don't see why that's different than when Alex Jones says something that's demonstrably untrue. I understand that people might be thinking of their own sort of internal thought process in a different way if they're Sanjay Gupta or if they're Joe Rogan, but that doesn't mean that the way that the audience is hearing them is necessarily all that distinct. When we hear media, we don't hear it as I'm watching Joe Rogan and therefore everything here is not to be taken seriously. I'm watching John Oliver and therefore everything here is not to be taken seriously. No, John Oliver, right, talks about civil asset forfeiture in serious ways. John Oliver talks about like real issues. Like, no, Joe Rogan has interviewed Bernie Sanders. Okay. When you are Joe Rogan and you are interviewing the head of like all medical correspondents for CNN, the chief medical correspondent for CNN, and that is what you're doing right now. You are acting as a journalist. I don't care if you want to be acting as a journalist. I don't care if you want to be perceived as a journalist. I don't care if you are reporting on, the smacky sport poof, other times of that same week. In that moment, you are a journalist, right? And when you are making a joke, in that moment, you are a comedian. And the obligations that come with comedy don't disappear just because you're not a comedian. The obligations that come with rhetoric, with political rhetoric, don't disappear just because you're not a rhetorician.
Sanjay, you're a prince. I don't know where you get your patience. I really don't. A remarkable display of calm and patience there. Thank you so much for that.
What a bad way to end it. Because essentially what he's saying is like, kudos to you. Earlier in this, they said Dr. Gupta goes into Lion's Den to talk to skeptic Joe Rogan. Think about like what you're framing there. Like it's not random that this has 17,000 dislikes. Part of that is just because there are a lot of people who are like, fuck you, like don't get it, the fuck of a vaccine, everything. The whole thing is a Jewish conspiracy. I don't know why I got into an Alex Jones voice, but like the point is that like that wasn't a very good Alex Jones voice either. And you shouldn't give me credit just because like, oh, I'm not a comedian and therefore it doesn't have to be good. Fuck you. The point is that like that isn't random, that it has 17,000 dislikes and only 6,000 positive responses. Right? It has to do with the fact that it's on YouTube. Yes, the fact that it's old media or legacy media interacting in a new media space, but it also has to do with the way that they're framing it. That framing at the end there, I'm just going to listen.
Where you get your patience.
I don't know where you get your patience.
I really don't. A remarkable display of calm and patience there. Thank you so much for that.
You're saying there that you are there to teach Joe. That's what he said, which at some level isn't necessarily false, right? Because it is true that Dr. Sanjay Gupta is Dr. Sanjay Gupta, that Sanjay Gupta knows a hell of a lot more about the science around COVID, a hell of a lot more about the science around medical issues writ large than does Joe. But it also, when you hear that and you're thinking as a member of the audience of these guys as the elites, these guys as, the millionaires who are working for billionaires, who are the partisan media, the media of the left, the media of the Democrats, the media of Washington, D.C., the media of blah, 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 blah. And then you have this person, you give him credit for his remarkable patience, for, going into the lion's den of, I'm not saying it's true anymore, right? Because Joe is, $100 million plus millionaire, right? Close to a billionaire potentially at some point. It wouldn't shock me if at some point he became a billionaire. Although I don't think he's there yet. But like when people are thinking about Joe as their stand-in for themselves, which is, I think, a lot of the appeal of the podcast world, right? When we think about like, why do people like watching Ben Shapiro? Well, because he's dunking on people, right? He is your stand-in. He is acting out what you want to be able to do when you hear a bunch of lefties saying the nonsense that you don't agree with. Why do we like Destiny on the left? Why do we like Vosh on the left? I don't like Vosh, but other people like Vosh, right? Why do people like all of these sort of debate bro people? Well, it's because we want to be able to debate bro, but we aren't able to do it as well as they are. And they are the ones who are stand-in. They're the ones who are acting out what we want to be able to say to someone like Sanjay Gupta, what we want to be able to say to someone, like these lefty college campus liberal, whatever the hell's, right? Like that's their value. And when we approach that by demeaning Joe, when we approach that by devaluing Joe, it's heard by the audience as though we're devaluing the audience themselves. And that's a real problem. So I think that this concerns me. I think that they're coming from a reasonable place. I don't think that they're bad people. But I think that they look like bad people. And that's a problem, particularly because in the context of vaccines, they're 100% right. And we really, really, really need people to get vaccines.